Hi everybody, thank you so much for having me. My name is Shannon Dosemagen, and I have been working at, I'd say, the connecting points of environmental and climate justice, open technology, and participatory science for about 2 decades. I've had the opportunity to sit in on some of the keynotes yesterday and the sessions, and I would say I'm kind of on the extreme user end of things, as you will see in my talk. But a lot of my work is actually about making translations between the different sectors and domains that I'm working in. So helping people that are working in the open to connect with folks in the climate and environmental movement, and vice versa. I'm also from 6 feet above sea level, so the altitude is really getting me. I might need to breathe for a second every once in a while. So in my talk today, I'm going to share some stories from my past. I'm going to talk about some ways that I think open source is pivotal for the environmental movement, and then also point out some challenges and places where I believe that open source can really be of benefit to the environmental and climate movements. So my very early work was in what's called Cancer Alley, or the Chemical Corridor. It's a region that stretches between Baton Rouge and New Orleans in Louisiana. There's a lot of other places that would qualify, but it's home to a huge number of petrochemical refining facilities. And I worked, this is almost 15 years ago, with communities to set up air monitoring programs. And it ranged in kind of a huge duration of what the tools were that we used. So thinking about our bodies as sensors, we used analog odor maps to document what we were smelling. So for instance, benzene coming from emissions smells like sweet almond oil. We also used replications of the EPA's SUMA canister. You can see the buckets in the picture. And this was before open science hardware was really even a thing. So these were creations that we made out of things locally available at hardware stores, and then bags that could actually capture the grab samples that we got from labs. The reason for doing this, and one of the pictures you can see that flame that's coming from the smokestack, was that sometimes in the middle of the night they would shoot off, so the facility would shoot off huge flames of emissions when EPA or the local DEQ could not come out to do monitoring. So it was really imperative that communities had the ability to do their own monitoring. And I always come back to this point in my work, in my career, because it taught me a really important lesson that I've always carried with me, and that's the importance of socially situating data, telling the story of the people in place with the data that you're collecting. And so instead of getting as close as possible to the industrial facility, we would capture data sets and air quality samples from the local kindergarten or from the steps of the community church or a community center that was important for that neighborhood. Okay. Sorry, right. After this work, I went on to co-found an organization called Public Lab, and we spent over a decade developing open tools for environmental monitoring. We built open tools such as what you see in this picture. This is a kite. We also had 5.5-foot weather balloons that had point-and-shoot cameras attached to them that we would send 3,000 feet up into the air to capture images of the BP oil disaster in the Gulf of Mexico, for instance. We also created open source software such as MapKnitter. So once we had captured those images on cameras, we were then able to stitch them into maps that told timely depictions of how the spill was affecting the Gulf Coast region. We developed a number of different tools, so we had the balloon mapping tool, near-infrared sensing cameras, pocket spectrometers, and we worked on a whole range of projects, from mountaintop removal, to other mining projects, to frac sand mining in the upper Midwest. And we did this around the world, supporting communities and asking and answering questions about environmental pollution. And it's really here that I learned about working in the open and the importance of it in terms of what it can do for scaling our work. So for instance, I could be one person doing this full time in the Gulf, but I have 250 volunteers that are like, put me on a boat, let me walk the beach, I'll capture images. And then another 1,000 that are sitting off in their living room stitching together images to make the maps that we did. It also taught me about the durability that we need to do environmental work, and open infrastructure provides that durability for us. And so it can go past the intrinsic moment that we're working in to create longevity for environmental problems, which many times are decades in duration. And it also taught me about the value of collective governance and thinking about the role of what communities needed in owning the data that they were collecting and making decisions about how they were sharing it and with whom. So after Public Lab, I received a Shuttleworth Fellowship, and I started thinking about ways that we needed to fix some of the other cracks. And I became really, really interested. I'm really an open science hardware person. That's like where my passion lies in the open world. So I really wanted to think about building and connecting people that were working in the sciences and including environmental monitoring with folks that were developing open hardware tools. I was also really interested in what was actually happening with data that communities were collecting and how was it making an impact and benefiting them in their advocacy work. And then I was also interested in exploring how I could get open communities and open technology projects more involved in climate and environmental work. And so I've co-founded or founded a bunch of projects, the Gathering for Open Science Hardware, Open Science Hardware Foundation, and most recently, Open Environmental Data Project. So Public Lab was really about a fast scale up of open technology in the environment and climate work that we were doing, as well as connecting it with the abilities for communities to be involved in the science. The work I was doing in open hardware was about connecting people, building the physical tools for science and inserting them into the environmental space. And Open Environmental Data Project has continued the work of community monitoring, but it's also looking at the ways that we use data in the environmental space in different ways. For instance, we have a project called Beyond Compliance, which looks at already existing open data sets to try to make them actually usable, because we know open does not actually mean usable, for people that are doing research in the environmental and climate spaces. And we have, we are really, I'm so happy to hear from the opening yesterday that technology is doing well. Climate and environment is not. The number of rollbacks we have seen in 2025 have been substantial. So one of the other projects that my team are working on is called the Public Participation and Environmental Data Partners. And we're working on building tools that can help to archive data sets that the federal government owns, the data tools, and then also websites before they go dark. So if you haven't noticed, the administration is currently taking down anything that mentions justice and climate change amongst a number of other things. So, I guess I would just pause here to say openness looks very, very different, and it feels very different when you're wearing a pair of shrimp boots and you're wading through a swamp and you're attached to a balloon that's caught a current of air 3,000 feet above you and you're kind of getting dragged along. Or you're in a kayak and you're trying to take a water sample, but there's a curious little alligator that keeps, merging its way over and you have to bump it every once in a while. Or you're taking data that you've collected or that a community has collected into the meeting rooms of a refinery to try to make the case for public health. It's a very different experience, I think, than what we see in many open projects. So I want to talk about 4 ways that I think open has been pivotal, and then I'll talk about some of the challenges that I see as well. And with each of the ones that are pivotal, I'm pointing you to projects that I really love. I encourage you to check in on them afterwards when you have some free time. The first thing I would mention is that the shared tools that we can create together for environmental monitoring have been really important in developing a shared set of utilities. In the water monitoring space, there could be somebody, like one person, who is monitoring a pond, monitoring a river, monitoring a stream, or looking at an entire watershed. And they're all working in different contexts, but many times the data they're collecting would be really valuable to one another. And the tools that they're using could be used in other contexts. And so making sure that we have tools that are connecting has been incredibly impactful in creating the infrastructure for this kind of work to happen. The second is, I'm just going to keep saying open hardware. So our physical science tools have been incredibly impactful for this space in creating the ability for communities to go out and do their own monitoring. It gives them, through the sensors they use, the kits they have, the community lab gear, it gives them the ability to really take labs out into the remote, many times remote places that they're working. It helps to reduce reliance on institutions and lab setups. It helps to support local learning and also, get people to fix the tools when they need to be fixed, learn how to use them in a number of different contexts. And so I would point you to the Gathering for Open Science Hardware, which I mentioned earlier. I think it's a great example of lots of different projects around the world that are thinking about the application of environment and open science hardware. The third, I think the work that the open community has done on governance and collaboration models has really been pivotal for the environmental space. We are organizers in climate and environment, but there are really cool models that have come from these the open communities, open projects that we've been able to port into the work that we're doing that's helped to create better transparency, distributed leadership, and also helped us to think about decision making around data and information in different ways. I would also mention that it really, when I started this work almost 20 years ago, the connections between communities and scientists and communities and government was tense at best. And I think it's really been useful in thinking about these collaborative models and different strategies for governance and making really strong connections across sectors so that we have better working relationships. The fourth that I'll mention is the role of preservation and portability. Open formats, public repos, it provides long-term access, and you really have to have long-term access to environmental data when you're doing enforcement and other types of decision-making. It helps us to be resilient to shutdowns, to policy changes, and to changes in political administrations. And if there's one project that you look at, I really encourage you to look at Open Weather. I think it's just an incredible group. For instance, they sent out a newsletter a couple weeks ago that I read. There was a NOAA satellite that was being decommissioned, and they did a call to arms to their network to go out and collect the last set of data. And they came up with these beautiful images. So please do check that out as well. So there's a lot of really great stuff going on with open in the environmental and climate space. It's contributed meaningfully. There's a lot of challenges that remain, though, and I'm very interested in ensuring that we're making impact where impact is needed most and not just doing openness for its own sake. So the first challenge that I would point out is that we need to do a lot of work in translating openness for frontline contexts. Openness is not always empowering. It can feel sometimes like exposure. I've sat in rooms where communities have explained how IP from them has historically been appropriated or stripped or taken inappropriately into different contexts. And so sometimes when people see the word open, it signals that there might be an issue forthcoming. So there's really sometimes a disjuncture in how open source communities are thinking versus what the community reality is. So we need to continue to find and work towards value alignment and the work that we're doing. The second challenge I point out is a need for holistic view of infrastructure. So a lot of environment, like I was saying, somebody might be monitoring a pond over in, where are we, Colorado. Somebody might be monitoring a swamp in Louisiana, and they don't even know that they exist, right? So we need a much more holistic view of infrastructure. So thinking about a whole system of where things are being hosted, who is doing the maintenance, how is governance being determined, so that we do have projects that are speaking together in a much more impactful way. And that's, it's everything. It's, when I talk about infrastructure, it's the code, the docs, the people, funding, the care networks. So we need to continuously be asking, from our open projects also, who keeps it running and how are they doing that? The third And you hear this all the time, I hear this all the time, and I'm just gonna say it again, is that we have to support open infrastructure. It's not just with funding, though, yes, that is very important, but also, time, maintenance, mentorship, doing the work of translating what you are working on into real life usable context is just incredibly important. I think a lot of that is the invisible labor that makes the backbone of these ecosystems work. So for my work to work, I need you all to do that work alongside me. And support comes in many different forms of contribution. I can't imagine that half of you would want to put on shrimp boots and walk through a swamp with a balloon attached to you, but there's a lot of other things that you can do to contribute as well. And finally, we have to continue as the open community to push to change policies shaping open source adoption. This is really part of our responsibility as open practitioners. Often, open tools are, they're excluded by design, not by the quality that they provide. And so making sure that we have a seat at the table to make openness the default will help us to enable good policy that doesn't block open approaches, but really embraces them. All right, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to speak with you, and find me at these links.